Good day and welcome to this session on defect liability. By the end of this section, you should be able to look at what defect liability is, define defect liability guarantee and defect liability period, the purpose of defect liability period, element of defect liability period, and then length and scope of defect liability period. So basically, defect liability is what we use to refer to the legal responsibility that a contractor has to repair and or cover the cost of any defect that is found in a completed or renovated infrastructural work. So after the execution of especially construction work, or after the execution of any procurement works within a given agreed on period of time, the contractor is expected to provide certain maintenance services to the procurement entity or the buyer, so that within the contract agreement, within that period, they are obliged, that is, the contractor is obliged to repair any defects that may arise in the completed work as stipulated in the contract. And it should be noted that the defect liability security or the defect liability guarantee is that amount of money that is kept by the buyer or the procurement entity, assuming, and then it is intended to assure the buyer that the contractor will perform any infrastructural works, any detected liability or defect in the works when they arise. So the defect liability on itself is the legal responsibility of the contractor to perform any repairs of defects in the completed works, whilst the defect liability security or guarantee is the amount of money or a commitment by the contractor that is retained by the procurement entity to assure the procurement entity that the contractor will actually complete the defects or fix the defects that are detected after the contract has been completed. And it should be noted that this obligation by the contractor is done within a given period that is stipulated in the contract, which is known as the defect liability period. That will be discussed subsequently. So defect liability guarantee is basically a commitment or a sum of money or some form of monetary loss that the contractor would suffer when they fail to repair any identified defects in the completed infrastructural works during the defect liability period. So, as has been explained, the defect liability guarantee is a sum of money which usually belongs to the contractor, and it's mostly 10% of the contract value that is retained by the client or that is retained by the procurement entity. Or it could also be an amount of money which is usually replaced with a bank guarantee for the same amount that the client has the right to use if the contractor fails to repair any damages or defects found in the completed or renovation works during the defect liability period. And one key thing that we have to note is that these terms, the terms of the defect liability as well as the defect liability guarantee and the defect liability period, are all usually stipulated in the contract. So the buyers do not externally determine this amount of money, and neither do they externally determine the defect liability period. So obviously the defect liability period is the time frame that they have the obligation to repair or cover the cost of any defect that is discovered in the infrastructure. And in terms of goods, defect liability period could be seen as the warranty period that you get, or the warranty that you get from buying goods online or goods from a supermarket. So that is how the defect liability period can be typically seen in terms of goods. Then The defect liability guarantee is retained by the client for the duration of the defect liability period, so that within the defect liability period, if no defect occurs, the buyer would or the client would procure the return, or the buyer will return the defect liability guarantee to the contractor if no defects occur or arise during the defect liability period. So a defect liability clause is incorporated into the contract to cover anything relating to defect liability. And some of the elements that is incorporated into the defect liability clause include the length of the defect liability period. And usually this is determined based on the nature or the complexity of the contract that is being undertaken by the parties or being executed by the contractor. Then the second element is the scope of the defects that the contractor is obliged to remedy. So they have to state it, because it's not everything that is likely to be covered in the defect liability clause. So you have to determine what is going to be covered by the defect liability guarantee, what is going to be covered as a defect, what is going to be covered by the contract in situations where the defects arise, and in what conditions will the money or the defect liability guarantee be used to fix any damages. Then the next one is any part of the contract sum retained by the employer as surety for the performance of the remedial work is also stipulated in the defect liability clause. And then procedures for notifying the contractor of the defects. So you have to also state those procedures, including the type of defect that is covered in the scope. Then the circumstances under which the defect liability period may be extended. So assuming there is an allowance for the likelihood that the period will be extended, you have to state the circumstances under which that period will be extended in the contract. So it should be noted that ideally or generally, contractors would like to exclude liability for defects that do not own to their own default. That is why the elements of the defect liability clause actually stipulate the scope of the defect liability, so that in situations which do not own to the contractor's faults, you cannot retain or you cannot use the monies of the defect liability guarantee to cover any damages. So usually the scope of the defect liability clause include any acts or omissions of the employer, their employee, agents and contractors other than the contractor. Then secondly, improper operation or maintenance of the works, and then use and operation of the works outside the specification. So this is what the contractor is not expected, or this is situations where the defect liability is usually not applicable, because in this instance it is not the contractor's default for an act of omission. It is not the contractor's default for improper operation or maintenance of the work. If you fail to maintain the work that have been completed by the contractor, you cannot retain their defect liability guarantee, because in the end you didn't exercise, you as the buyer failed to exercise due diligence. And then the last one, to use an operation of the works outside the specification. So maybe you've bought or you've procured an item for, let's say, a given use, but you are using that item for a different use, and then a defect or a damage occurs. You cannot say you are retaining the defect liability guarantee to cover that defect, because in the end that's not the purpose for which the item was made by the. So you've learned about defect liability guarantee, and defect liability period, the purpose of the defect liability period, element of the period, and then the length and scope of defect liability period.